Good evening and welcome here tonight to 5 by 15, and it's my huge pleasure to be here talking to Jess Phillips, the MP for Birmingham Yardley and the best-selling author and outspoken, probably the most outspoken person in Westminster today. I hope that's fair to say. Jess is here to talk about her new book, Everything You Really Need to Know About Politics: My Life as an MP. So I'd first like to say that this is an absolutely compulsive read. I couldn't put it down. And I also thought when I was reading it, why has nobody done this book before? To tell you about the crazy, chaotic, illogical, but absolutely amazing life as an MP. This is the third time Jess has been with us at 5 by 15, and I couldn't be happier to be welcoming her back. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, because we will come to them after about 40 minutes or so, and I know you'll have lots of questions for her. So no further ado, let me bring Jess into the conversation. And I actually want to start with something you say right at the end of your book, which is when you talk very personally about what politics is. And you say politics is essentially the school you go to, the hospital that gets you when you're ill, the doctor you see, the dentist you see, all the services that we have around ourselves that we take too much for granted, I think, too often. But that, in fact, is what politics is about, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello, Rosie, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I suppose what I'm trying to get across all the way throughout the book is that politics is in everything that we do and say. And often when I go into schools and talk to young people and children in my constituency, trying to get them to fathom that the amount of time they even like their day is decided on some committee in some room in Westminster, literally the hours and minutes that they spend on different things, like their everything, their whole existence is a sort of political act that was decided by people weighing up what was best and what was needed. But also on the doorstep in Yardley and wherever I knock doors in the country, you see people who will say things like, well, I've never claimed anything in my life. And during the pandemic, I hear this a lot, like people for the first time going on to universal credit or seeking some of the assistance that the government has had, whether it's furlough or some of the business grants. And they're like, oh, it makes me feel uncomfortable. I've never claimed anything in my life. And there is this sort of badge of honor that people wear where they haven't interacted with, whether it's formalized the welfare system is actually what they're talking about. And what I will always say in those circumstances is you've been claiming since the moment you were born. You have been claiming against the taxpayer and the system that you live in, literally as you took your first breath into this world. You will have been there assisted by somebody who was being paid for by your neighbours, your family, your friends. And every step you've taken on any street, the planning of the house that you live in, the absolutely every moment, whether the sort of job that you was brought to your area, where it doesn't mean taking money out of a cash point that is the taxpayer. And so often us and them of politics, like the people who pay taxes exist over here and the people who take money out of the system exist over here. But every single person in the country, whether they are completely welfare dependent, they are still a taxpayer. They will still be paying VAT on almost everything that they buy. Every single person is a taxpayer in the system, and every single person is somebody who takes out of the system. There isn't an us and them in that, and every single part of that is divvied up and decided by the people who bother to turn up and fight for it being divvied up and divided more for them, more for their people, and they send people to do that to Westminster. And so when people say, well, I don't really understand politics, that's another thing I hear a huge amount of. I just think we've got to totally demystify the idea that politics is legislative and committees and things like that. It is everything. It is the first breath you take right up until how you die. It is all, I suppose, cradle to grave, famously said. It is all a decision that is made by somebody. And so you better make sure that you've got the right somebody making that decision. If you want to be born healthy and die with dignity, you better hope that there are people in that building that you feel you have power over, that you feel you can engage with, that you feel you can take time to understand exactly what it is, because you can't escape it. You cannot escape the politics in your life, and you are both a giver and a taker in every regard.
So how old were you when you first made that realization that politics is about everything that's around you? Because most of us don't make that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I was given no choice but to make that connection, because politics was literally everything that was around me from the moment I first breathed. My family are deeply, deeply political people, and I was born under Thatcher to very, very activist socialist parents. And so the main memory of my childhood, even from I remember like being stuffed into a buggy that was meant to like be for one kid, but there was like 4 of us in there, from Women's Liberation Playgroup, which is where I went to before I went to school. I went to Women's Liberation Playgroup, which was a playgroup cooperative set up by the women in the local Labour Party because they had wanted to work, and in the 1980s there was no state-funded formalised childcare. I mean, that didn't exist until my own children were born, in fact. And so they had set up this cooperative, and even the fruit and vegetables that we ate in our house came from this like sort of food cooperative that we were part of, where somebody from down our road would all club together, and somebody from down our road would go out each week to the market and then give out this food. I mean, now very, very middle class people are paying an absolute arm and a leg for this service that basically Ron from down the road used to do on my street many years ago. So everything that we did, so all the bonfire parties that we went to, everything in our life was organised by a collective of people seeking to work as a community to improve things. And so I think I was raised to believe in like the idea of a common endeavour, but not just like these days. People will talk about socialism until they're blue in the face, and there's collectivism and things. But we actually lived in an almost communal manner, and so the idea that our lives were affected by the efforts and endeavours of other people was made very, very, very clear to me from a very young age.
And did you grow up in an era where your parents would make the link back from what was going on, 4 of you in a buggy, back to Mrs. Thatcher?
Oh, literally everything was Mrs. Thatcher's fault, though, to be fair. I think she probably copped the blame for things that she had almost nothing to do with. But oh, absolutely. So we were, my nan used to come round to my house on a Thursday and because my mum worked, and do the ironing. I'm not sure my mum ever asked her to. I think my nan just really liked ironing, and my granddad would cut the lawn. It's a sort of, I like to think that they were giving a slight sideways glance to my working parents, as if they were growing up in squalor because they had to go to work. And I would watch PMQs with my nan, sat at my nan's feet while she ironed and peeled potatoes like a sort of 1950s woman. It was always, we were always, and at dinner time we would sit around and talk literally about the politics of the day from when I was a tiny kid. And when we were in those buggies, we were on the miners' marches, we were on general strikes, we were taking always CND on our faces. Literally, the amount of face paint I have, the amount of bomb banning I was forced into as a child without any agency. We were releasing balloons, but it was always linked with what we were doing and why it was a failure in politics for women, for example, and why there was a failure in politics in education, and what, it was always linked back to that big house where I now work.
And had your parents ever, I mean, you obviously became an MP, but did you think it was something your mother would ever have thought about, or had it Did it become your generation that was able to take it on?
Yeah, I think it was a generational thing. Now, the woman, Jane Slowey, who was one of my mum's friends, she stood, I think, in the 1992 general election for the seat that we lived in, but didn't win. It was Tory. I mean, it seems shocking now that that seat was ever Tory. Birmingham has definitely taken. It used to be much more bellwether than it is now. But so I knew somebody, so I had campaigned and done leafleting and put up posters for a woman I knew whose children were in my class, who was on the council and was stood, but not my mum and dad. Funnily enough, they never were interested in formalised roles within politics themselves, not even like at a sort of CLP, constituency Labour Party level. They were the worker ants. They were the people who housed the meetings and, you know, buttered the baps and organised the posters to be kept in our garage, which, you know, I'd say almost all of the 1980s Labour posters are still in my dad's garage because they may come in useful one day. But no, my mum was she went on to be quite eminent within the health service, and she advised both Tory and Labour health secretaries. In fact, gave Andy Burnham his first job in health. My mum did, and he's always got lovely things to say about her. But no, she was not. I don't think she ever considered taking on a formalised role ever. The only time she died before I was even elected onto the council. But I remember her saying to me when I said I was thinking of maybe standing for the council in Birmingham, and she said, "The thing is, Babby, is it won't be hard to shine on Birmingham City Council."
So tell us about your journey to becoming an MP, because, you know, from you write a lot about how much money you had to raise, how difficult it was. It seems like an absolutely, when you lay it out like that, a pretty impossible journey for someone to undertake. I mean, not to mention the fact you have to stop work for all that time when you roughly
Yeah, it is really, really hard. And I think if I had been as aware before I made the decision to do it, I might have paused. I would still have done it without question, but I might have paused for thought for a little bit longer, to think about the risk to my family and my finances without question. So when it was just after my mum had died, and I absolutely put this down to both a homage to her life as a political animal, but also just, you know, I had 2 kids and I just lost my mum. I wasn't even 30 yet. And I've always, as a coping mechanism for anything, thrown myself into being busy, almost hyperactive to the point of manic. I think that definitely there are moments of mania in my behaviour when I'm trying to cope with something. And so at the time, I had just rejoined the Labour Party because having left over the Iraq War, but I had just rejoined the Labour Party to vote in the 2010 leadership election. And within months of rejoining the Labour Party was sending out, Ed Miliband had this whole scheme about trying to get more, for want of a better word, ordinary people, because most people in Westminster are quite ordinary, actually. There are outliers, but most of us are ordinary people. But the idea of not ending the era of slick politics, of going to Oxford to do PPE and then going on to be a special advisor and then moving on to become a member of parliament. There was this sort of desire to have people who'd had ordinary jobs and were working in their communities, community organising. And just before my mum had died, I'd been a victim of some serious arson attacks on my street. So there were terrible antisocial behaviour, and there were, over a period of months, lots of cars had been set on fire in my street. And I had seen my community falling apart with fear and aggression towards each other, and it was making them turn on each other. And so I organised a series of big events and street parties to try and make them feel better about where we live. And the Labour Party spotted it and got in touch with me and said, would you go on this future candidates programme that Ed Miliband has set up? Because we want people like you. I'd not been to a meeting. The first Labour Party meeting I went to in 20 years was the selection meeting where I was selected to be on the council. So I was not like, you know, every day being an activist at the time, but I was a community activist without question. And so they really approached me. And then I just thought, oh, well, yeah, maybe I'll try and become a member of parliament then. Like, this actually sort of became like a sort of career progression of like, oh, actually, this is something that I could do. And these people are giving me permission and seeking me out. And so I took the decision quite lightly. And then, as I detail in the book, I was elected. Back then was in the first and only time that the Fixed Term Parliament Act actually ever worked. So the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with the Conservatives, and they set up the Fixed Term Parliaments Act essentially to protect them from this becoming an unstable government. And so I was selected 2.5 years out from the election actually happening, without really any realization that this would mean huge detriment to my family's finances. My husband had to stop being a night shift worker and drop like £10,000 a year in his salary over 2.5 years. So you're already looking at £30,000 because he couldn't work a night shift anymore, because I had to work in the evenings on the campaign and at the weekends on the campaign, and his shift pattern didn't allow for our children to be then looked after in that period. And so yeah, it's hugely difficult thing to do. And I think people think that people get paid. There's a common misconception, the idea that you're a candidate, that you get paid by your political party. I didn't. I had a job working at Women's Aid, and I didn't have the Labour Party didn't give me any money to run the campaign. You have to raise that money as well. And so it is an incredibly treacherous thing. And of course, for most women, you are not standing in a safe seat. Most women stand in marginal, winnable seats. And it's why women last less long, because their seats are more likely to be marginal. And so I was doing all of that, working every hour God sent, with much less money than we had been used to. Like, my mortgage cost the same. At the same time, as there was no certainty that I would win the election. In fact, it was 50-50 that I would.
And if you'd lost, that would have all have been, in a sense, wasted time, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And politics needs to have a kick up the bum about what it does with those people. Because when I stood for election, there was a woman who stood in a similarly marginal seat that she didn't win. And she was actually outside of where she lived. I very conveniently, in fact, I wouldn't have been able to do it had it not been the place where I live, without question. But that's quite uncommon. And she was standing in a seat sort of like 50 miles away from where she lived. And so the travel, and she was a single mom with 4 kids, and she didn't get elected. And the party does almost nothing. And I'm sure it's the same with all political parties. They do almost nothing in cases where candidates have given up their lives. It's as if it's like an honor for you to stand, like you should just be grateful. But that does not then breed a politics where anyone can take part, and is really problematic. And the likelihood is, and in fact, in her case, she's like, I'm never standing again. I'm not putting myself through that, my family through that, for nothing. And whereas, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is how the Conservatives, they send people around the country to stand in like nosebleed seats where they can never win. So most Conservative members of Parliament, it's slightly different in times of a snap general election, because you just have to fill the spaces quickly. But most Conservative members of Parliament have stood in a seat that they could never win. I think the famous example being Jacob Rees-Mogg standing in like Fife or somewhere in like the Docklands of Glasgow or somewhere like that. It was where you have to pay your dues. But that's fine if you can afford to pay your dues. But I had a job and a mortgage and 2 kids and a husband. It's a manual job. This is not like, it's not easy for ordinary people to do that, and which is probably why Tory MPs largely come from the upper classes.
Yes. So jumping forward a bit. So what was your first day in Westminster like? What did you expect when you arrived in that ramshackle, extraordinary building?
I mean, I don't know actually I genuinely didn't. I don't think I had any expectations of what it would be like, other than historic. And it certainly felt like that. It's certainly like, you can't believe that you're about to do this. But it's phenomenal. But I took my children with me because it was going to be such a massive life change for them. I wanted for them to be part of the transition so that, I mean, my youngest son was only 5 at the time, and I wanted him to understand why I wasn't going to be there, rather than just suddenly disappearing for the whole week every week. And his understanding was, I remember him once, I said, do you want to come to a Labour Party meeting? And he'd come along, and he thought it was a party, and he was like, why is there no cake? So he was already disappointed by politics by the age of 5. But I remember getting there, and you go, and this was new in the year that I got there. It certainly didn't exist before. I have no idea how people coped. You go along into one of the rooms in the modern bit of Parliament, and you sit at these different desks, and basically get 5 minutes where somebody says, right, you're basically going to be running your own business. So people don't realise this about members of Parliament, is that we are small business owners, and that the staff that I employ are entirely employed by me. They are not employed by Parliament. I am responsible for their HR. It's my responsibility to set up an office. Nothing gets given to you. So I have to set up a constituency office. I have to employ the staff. I have to make sure that all of the different laws are followed around their HR, and lots of MPs. I was lucky. I came from being a manager in a place that had 137 staff. So I had an idea. And then you go along to another desk, and they're like, here's your security pass, you can go anywhere. And nobody at any point tells you what your job is. The Labour Party put on some I remember Dennis Skinner giving us a lecture in the chamber about how to command the chamber, and the kind of things that you can say. And I remember Heidi Alexander, who was a whip at the time, she said maybe go into business questions on a Thursday, and you think, what's business questions? I literally don't even know what that is, because it's where you can talk about anything, and you'll get used to the pace of the place, sit through the sessions. But other than that, you basically invent your job as a member of Parliament, and you can make it exactly what you want it to be. You can make it nothing. You could literally do nothing. You could never turn up to Parliament. You could never hold a surgery in your constituency, and there's absolutely nothing that can be done about that until next time when you don't get elected, unless you're lucky enough to have a safe seat and the people don't mind. But you have no idea. And so I went about just creating exactly what I'd come from, which was working in the sort of community sector, charitable sector, and I just went about making my job that again, because I knew how to do that.
Sure, that's really interesting. I mean, how many people do you think do nothing? But also, can you say a bit more about how you have to? I mean, you've got a very strong focus now,
yeah,
a very strong profile, which makes you much more powerful, it seems to me,
yeah,
and more influential than someone who tries to do a bit of everything and
yeah,
then has actually no deep knowledge of anything.
yeah.
So how do you divvy up the kind of MPs that you see in terms of, how much they do and how they
there is a certain category. There's different categories of MPs. There are some who every single week in Prime Minister's Questions, back in the days when we were in there, somebody will stand up to ask a question because they've been drawn in the lottery to ask the question. Again, I think people think that that we get to choose who gets to ask the questions. We don't. It's a total lottery. It's like numbers out of a bag. And every week someone will stand up and you think, I've no idea who that is. I've never seen them before. And it's because they're not a Westminster beast. So there's one category of Member of Parliament that are absolutely chamber animals. They are Westminster beasts, and they are in the chamber all the time, and they will speak on almost anything that there is to speak about. And there is a real skill in some of that they are then being seen by their constituents to be across everything. Like, they've got an opinion on absolutely every possible, collectivism petition that their constituents have said. They will be able to say, I stood up and I spoke in this debate. And so there is that category, and that makes up probably about 25% of members of Parliament. They become very, very deeply ingrained in the place, in Westminster and in Westminster life, and they're the ones in the bar at the end of the day. And then I'd say another quarter are about probably have marginal constituencies and just get completely embedded within their constituencies. And so you don't see so much of them at Westminster. They are just out there talking about potholes. Liberal Democrats talk about potholes a huge amount. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book called, you know, people care about potholes, so you just have to suck that up. But there is those who do that, who become completely and utterly. And at first, I have to say that was my lot in life, was to become a very, very heavily well-known constituency MP, good at casework, good at responding, have an office that people come into, run it like a community centre, because I had a marginal seat. My seat is not marginal now, and the legacy of that continues. But you have to learn to trust other people to be doing a lot of that work for you, and at first you just don't, because especially if you've taken your seat. And my seat wasn't Labour before I had it. And so on election day in 2015, I mean, I literally arranged for a lift for a woman in Labour, because I was like, it's going to come down to the last vote, because that's what I thought. And it's hard to move on from the psyche of every vote counts. And so whenever anyone comes to you with any request, you'll be like, yes, I'll do it immediately. I'll do it immediately. Like anything I can do for you, you can have my firstborn child, because it's frightening having a marginal seat. And so it takes quite a long time being an MP to not have that fear, especially if you're in a marginal seat, which arguably most of them are these days. They flip around.
Can I interrupt quickly there? I mean, do you think that not being in a marginal seat makes you a better MP? Does it make you have more abilities?
No, I think that being in a marginal seat makes you a better MP personally. I think it makes you more responsive. I mean, I think that there are perfectly good MPs who have safe seats and have always had safe seats, but I think that you are likely to be much more responsive to your constituents and the nuances and differences within your constituency, which is essentially a sample of the country. If you basically are more frightened of them. I want members of parliament to be more weary of their voters than they often are. And so, however, you definitely have much more opportunity to, and you see it in the division of staff. So we have a budget that will pay for around 5 or 6 full-time members of staff. And you can see the MPs who have safe seats because they have like 4 members of staff servicing them in London. Whereas most of my members of staff are there for my constituents. They are based in Birmingham doing constituency work, doing constituency campaigning, holding on to things in Birmingham, and I have a member of staff in London. Whereas you see the Westminster MPs, they put their staff in London, and they have things like chiefs of staff, which seems wildly like they've watched too much West Wing. They have people writing endless questions, parliamentary questions, writing to be in every debate, so that you can see how that is different. Now we need both things. You need absolute Westminster animals. The other sort of MP, which is I suppose the sort of MP that I have become, is a campaigning MP with basically the chomp between their teeth in that they have a thing that they went there to do. And I suppose so all the work I do around violence against women and girls means that you have a clarity of voice on those issues that and lots of MPs. So a good example, Diana Johnson, who is an amazing Westminster MP, who has done all of the stuff around the blood contaminated blood crisis that has finally got an independent review happening of it. So that is but she just very singularly focused, will keep on an issue, and she does it with other issues, but once she has an issue, politics will bow to her because she doesn't stop. And she is a really good example of a campaigning MP who can pick up a campaign and push and push and push using both her constituents and Westminster. And then you have about 20% who don't do anywhere near as much as they should. Often they're the ones who end up in the cabinet. I'm afraid.
That's extremely interesting that you have that division between people. So for you've now got a high profile, and I was very struck in your book, you describe a typical Monday, and you describe also waking up and thinking, you use this incredible expression, have I committed news?
Yeah.
I thought it was brilliant. I mean, have I inadvertently sent the wrong tweet, done the wrong thing?
Yeah.
Somehow I have become the news again. And you also talk about the feeling of waking up in kind of panic and anxiety
Totally.
as you check. So what's your morning like on Monday morning?
So on a Monday morning, I will wake up. I naturally, I had my children very young, so I naturally I have a body clock that wakes me up at around 5:45 in the morning, even though my children now don't get up until 6 o'clock in the evening. I wake up, and I often, especially at the moment, it's slightly better after COVID, making our work-life balance considerably more life than work, and Parliament is currently in recess, so I have it a little bit less at the moment, although not entirely less. You, especially on a Sunday night or any day that you've been in Westminster, I will wake up, and I wake up early, and I wake up with a gasp of like, oh gosh, what thing is it going to be today? And it's the same when any phone number that I don't recognise calls me, and somebody has called me 3 times today from a phone number I don't recognise. I just think, oh my God, what is it? What is the thing that I'm going to have to react to? So the first thing I do in the morning is I will immediately look at my phone to see if there is a million calls. You can always tell when something's going on, because you will wake up to 150 messages and like 8 missed calls, and you can tell that there is some news going on. And sometimes that news is something you have said, something that you've done wrong, something that is in your wheelhouse. And so, for example, on the day that Sarah Everard her body was found, it was literally like carnage for me to wake up to, of just hundreds of requests on your time, hundreds of requests for comment constantly. And you have to very, very quickly in the morning, when there is something going on, you have to very, very quickly brief yourself with the facts, because you are about to, within an hour, be in front of a public, and you have to have an opinion on somebody being murdered in a Saudi Arabian prison that you've literally never heard of as you went to sleep. And so every morning there is the potential for that. And so every morning I wake up to that gasp of, what is the thing going to be today? And usually Mondays are the worst. I never sleep on a Sunday night with the sort of the week at Westminster ahead of you. And then obviously I have to get my children to go to school and things, although that has got considerably easier as they've got older. And I try to keep a normal pattern of life, like a normal person. I try to sit and drink a cup of coffee with my husband before he goes to work. But 9 times out of 10, and there's this awful thing, and loads of MPs who've read the book has said to me, this hit me right in the heart, is that my son will refer to me as Jess, not as Mum, because he says I respond to Jess when I'm looking at my phone in the morning, and I don't respond to Mom, and that is like a deeply painful thing for me to realise, but it is the truth. I am usually in the mornings just completely and utterly tied to my phone, before I will then set off on a train journey to go down, because I obviously don't live in London, to go down to Westminster, where as soon as you arrive at like midday until probably 11 o'clock at night on a Tuesday, you are then called upon to be in meeting after meeting and committee after committee, and you never have 5 minutes to think about the next thing. And that's why we have to have people running behind us saying, this thing that you're going to now is about, I don't know, like Malawian orphanages, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've got to be immediately briefed. And you have to try and be an expert on so many things. And one thing I learned very early on is that you can't do it. There are enough cancers to keep you. So when you're first there, every single sort of cancer will get in touch with you and ask you to be a voice on this specific sort of cancer. And even just cancers on their own, there is too many for any one member of Parliament to become an expert and a campaigner on those things. And so you have to learn to say no to things, which is very, very hard when you're first elected. And most Mondays and most Tuesdays and Wednesdays while I'm in Westminster, I will be sat in front of people desperate for me to take up their case, where ultimately I'm just not going to be able to, whether it's lobbyists around different diseases, different disabilities, whatever it is, there just isn't the space and time to care about everything, because as we started by saying, politics is everything.
So how do you decide? I mean, how does any MP decide? I mean, you have lots of good anecdotes in the book about extraordinary things that your constituents ask you. I mean, I love the person who wrote into you and said, could you tell me what time the post office opens on a Saturday? And you think, heavens. But then you think, well, people don't know where else to turn. And also, you have this vast expectation that an MP can set off to London and somehow change
everything.
And it'll all be better because Jess is a good person.
Yeah, expectations management is absolutely everything. It is vital for members of parliament. And it's actually one of the things I would say is deeply wrong with our current politics is the desire, and it comes about from having to win elections, the desire for politicians to stand in front of X building and claim that they had anything to do with building it, makes people's expectations that you can build something in their constituency that, oh, well, you know, they got a children's centre, and it's just like, okay, well, let me tell you what that process is. That photo that you saw is a lie. It's you know, it's I suppose you could, it's definitely true that got built, but the idea that you asked for it, we delivered it, is just a terrible myth that politicians continue to spin without explaining the actual process that you have to go through, and that the thing you want has a cost, not necessarily a financial cost, because any Labour politician, where they're so immediately the first question a journalist asks you is, how are you going to pay for that? So the it's not even that, the cost of not having something else and somebody else not having something else is not something that politicians communicate correctly with the public, and we're not honest about it. Where we try and promise the moon on a stick in order to win an election, and then, so with my constituents, the line I say almost 100 times a day when I'm in my constituency office, and the constant thing that I try to put into my literature when I'm talking to my constituents is, you did this, we did this together. There is an element that you have to do something and I have to do something, but this isn't you ask, I deliver, because that is just not the reality. But also I say, I'm not going to guarantee you that I'm going to be able to do anything about this, but I will guarantee you that I will try. And I must say that sentence, it should be written on my gravestone. I try constantly not to promise anything to anyone. I'd much rather under promise and over deliver. But when it comes to elections, politicians can't help it. The currency, the promise currency, and it's what makes people hate us, is that, oh, you said you were going to do this and then nothing ever happened. You said we'd get a new railway station and nothing has happened. So we have got to stop it, because the expectations management is making people hate politics and hate politicians, and it just treats people as if they're stupid and they can't listen when you say, okay, you're absolutely right, this is what's wrong with universal credit, so I'm going to tell you now that this is going to take me around 10 years to change this, and you have to take part in that as well. But that's the reality of the thing you've come to talk to me about. So we can try and deal with your issue right now, but changing it for the future is going to take a huge amount of time. And so much of what I was writing in the book is about how change is very, very possible, but we must be realistic about how it actually happens and how long it can take. But that is really, really problematic, is the thing that where people think that I have a drawer in my office that's got council houses in it. And maybe there were times where that was the case, and there was definitely levels of, you know, corruption in politics, where, you know, where you could, like, you know, tip a wink to somebody and make sure so and so got a council house, but this is just simply not the reality for me. But people think that when they come to me and say, well, I've got 7 people living in 2 rooms, you know, can you get me a house? They genuinely come there with the belief, because of the way that politics spin their abilities, that I can do that, and I haven't got a hope in hell.
So you tell a wonderful story in the book about you looking after Annie, trying to get your constituents of yours into rehab, get her sorted out. And I just read it and I thought, how many of your constituents can you do that for? I mean, that was being just the social worker, unpaid at that point, out of hours, going around to her house on Saturday evenings. It's a very touching and lovely story. I mean, do you then set up again an expectation?
Yeah, I mean, partially, yes. And you can't do it for all cases. However, I suppose what we have to try and do in most cases is set up parameters whereby we are there to support them on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays in the constituency office between these hours. And that's like working in any sort of charitable sector with vulnerable people. This is to create a sort of boundaried availability so that you don't have expectations management. But then there are cases where people's lives don't fit into those boundaries, and what may have once been there and been able to be provided for people with mental health problems, people victims of domestic abuse, or just people in any sort of a crisis. Like, you know, a woman got in touch with me last week and said, my daughter has been on a trolley in your local hospital for 4 days and she just needs a bed. I mean, you know, say, oh, sorry, it's 5 o'clock. Sorry, I can't help you. Like, you have to learn to judge. And 9 times out of 10, in fact 10 times out of 10, people who really need your help and support beyond the pale of duty, the times when you shouldn't be necessarily doing it and that you might be setting up a poor expectation, 10 times out of 10 those people don't want you to be doing it. They don't want you. They feel terrible and they are not expecting anything of you, and they feel bad that you are there. Whereas the people who have lesser problems will be bothering you all the time. I have to say that's definitely true. But you just have to, and I am well trained because of my previous experience of working in refuges. I am well trained in when you know that you can go beyond the core. And the story about Annie, in that, I mean, maybe when the paperback comes out, I would have to put some caveat on an explainer on it, in that unfortunately I didn't help her. I wasn't able to help her, and she died of coronavirus. And because she's 43 years old, and she died because of comorbidities that meant she just couldn't survive it when she got it. And so even when you go beyond the pale, and I will sit in her house on a weekend with her big dog, and even in those circumstances, I can't save people, and I shouldn't, and nobody should ever crusade to the point where you think you're some sort of superhero, because I am not a superhero. I'm just trying to be kind, and that's enough. So I suppose that's the parameter.
Well, that's a fantastic parameter, and I'm really sorry to hear that, because it was a very touching story. We've got lots of questions coming in, and actually we've been talking for 45 minutes and it's gone by so fast. Okay, I'm just going to lob you one last question before we come to the audience, which is just about the current government. I was so cross when the announcement was made for the 3% rise for the nurses, and then you find out that it's coming out of the budget. And you feel really powerless about something like that. And it also feels mean, and many other things. It's like the removal of the £20 uplift in universal credit that's coming down the pipe, apparently. What do you do, Jess, as you, and how do you feel about it? And be as rude as you like.
I mean, you feel utterly, well, it's like stages of grief, isn't it? You go through, initially, you're like, what the fuck? Like, are you joking? And then I feel deep aggression, genuinely aggression towards people making decisions like that about the £20. And I think, are you not seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Because, and I take to Twitter all the time, and I've done it under every government I have served under since becoming a member of parliament, and asked the minister in question to come and spend a day in my constituency office, because I can only assume they're not seeing the same thing that I am seeing. They're not seeing nurses, not just a nurse, a matron on a ward coming into my office on a Friday to get food bank vouchers because her husband is dying of cancer and is no longer able to work, and she's coming in with her children, and we sit and we lie to the children and we say, like, oh yeah, I always get my food from the food bank. And if they are not seeing what I am seeing, and then you start to feel utterly powerless, and you think, how can, and then you have to think through calmly, what are the things that I can do, or at least try and do, that will hang this on them? What can I do to raise this profile? What story can I tell that is going to hit them and land so that they will realise? And for too long, the Labour Party has not been good enough. And so the current government will dance around as if they are Teflon. Whereas Marcus Rashford is a perfect example of, so what is it going to take? And it's not necessarily me telling the story or the Labour Party telling the story that I have to think about. I have to think, who is the best messenger? Is it a Tory member of parliament? Is the best messenger to get the 20% uplift stopped? I need to go and talk to some Tory members of parliament who have been elected in seats where I know there will be loads of people who have universal credit. And I have to think through, is my voice going to be the one? Is it the user voice that I need to get out there? Is it a famous person? What is it that's going to get this? And what are the levers? What are the parliamentary levers? And so then I will spend my time thinking about, like, in the acknowledgements of the book, I pay credit to Chris Bryant, who is a member of parliament, who understands parliament in a way that I'm never going to bother to try. And so I will ring him and say, what is the thing that we can do? Is it this sort of debate? Is it this sort of vote? Is it this sort of ballot? How do we, how do we censure this? How do we stop it? And that that's ultimately what you have to do. You go through, your anger and aggression, and you're publicly very cross and dismissive, and then you have to step back and think, well, what am I actually going to do about this? What am I going to do? And so that is the process. And even if you fail, like I failed with Annie, even if you fail, you are able to get up every morning and keep failing, because at least you tried. Yeah. And people see it and people appreciate it, and that's all you can do. And obviously try and get rid of them.
So there's a number of questions coming in about how we re-engage people with politics, and a couple of people saying, that your book is really easy to read, and it ought to be more available in schools, all of which I absolutely agree with. But in a way, it seems to me also, especially through the pandemic, that Westminster or the Tory government have really liked this. They like the mystique. They like the feeling, yeah, we'll take care of it, don't worry your little heads about it.
Totally.
So how do we change that?
Well, I mean, the truth is that we have got to make politics much more accessible, and there is no quick and easy way of doing that. Obviously, I would like to see it taught in France, where my brother is a teacher. They teach philosophy, which is essentially like, the sort of philosophy and government as well. They teach from like the age of 4. And getting kids to be arguing over things and debating things. And so, obviously I would like to see much, much better I hate the term citizenship. I don't know why that sort of came about as being the term for it, but politics. I think politics should be being taught, and certainly in an age where everybody can be a bloody journalist on their phone, the idea of how you campaign and how we interact with the media and what is good and what is harmful and what is right, like the ethics of things. Somebody who speaks a lot about court cases, I balk at the lack of understanding of the criminal justice system. When people talk about it online, it is like, oh my God, you don't even know anything about courts or anything. And so, but most people in our country don't know that the police don't make the decision on who to charge in a court case, that is done by the Crown Prosecution Service, and that most people don't know that victims don't have a lawyer because they watch courtroom dramas where people are sat next to lawyers. There is so much about how our society runs and works that people have no idea about. So much better education. But failing that, and failing putting everything on the shoulders of teachers, because I'm also putting on them trying to teach better gender roles, teach against domestic abuse, I'm making them social workers as well. So failing the fact that teachers probably have enough on their plates. We've all got to, and anyone who cares about this and cares about changing the way that our politics works, which lots and lots of people do, you have to care about it in an active way, and you have to go out and encourage people to take part, not just in voting, but like doing something down your street. The reason I'm a member of Parliament is because there was a problem on my street, and I saw that the people were getting fractious and opting out, wanting to move away. You have to take an active role in going and speaking to somebody else and saying, how about we try and do something about this, and let's try and change something. And it is on politicians. I mean, maybe we need much better regulations about the kind of things you can and can't say, the kind of thing, like the lies that get told, not just actual lies, that's everybody knows that about politics, the way things get spun, the way that money will be re-announced over and over and over and over again 1 million times. It's just like, it's the same money, and nobody's going to see a change on their street, and they're going to think, oh, why has nothing changed when you told me you were spending all of my money on it? And that is it. So, you know, maybe there needs to be considerably better rules in public life, but at the moment we're smashing them all.
So there are a lot of questions, one from Howard, one from others, from various people, talking about relationships with the opposition. And there's a line in your book where you say, you know, most people go to Westminster intending to do good and intending to try to change the world. It's just not always how I see it. So there is a sort of feeling in an awful lot of, I mean, I know lots of Tory MPs too, and they want to get things right. So how much do you work together, and how much can you work together? And is our two-party system always sort of fated to shove people apart?
It's funny because since I'm not a backbencher anymore, I find it much harder to get Tories to do the things that I wanted them to do. So most of the domestic abuse bill, you know, half of it I drafted in with the ministers, sat in a room working with them day and night, because they recognised my expertise, and I wasn't a threat because I wasn't up at the dispatch box. But we work together all the time, and no one ever sees anything but the combat moments. Most of the stuff that comes out of Parliament comes from committees where you are cross-party and you are working to scrutinise the government together. Tories are considerably more powerful when they try and scrutinise their own government, because it hurts much more for them to be doing it. But yeah, we work together all the time, and 90%, I say in the book, 90% of people went there to do good. We just think that there is a different route, but in lots of cases we think that there is the same route, and we think anyone who is a constituency MP, for example, will, if you say the words child support agency to them, doesn't matter how rich the people are in their area or how much farming they've got compared to urban, they will all be like, oh, the child support agency is just such a nightmare. And because they're working with their constituents, and so you can work with them on all sorts of issues where you have absolutely got common cause and that aren't deeply ideologically political. That are just about how things work and whether they work well or not. And on those things, we work together all the time. I wish that more people could see that actually, if you come into Portcullis House, we are all sat around the same tables. We are all, with the journalists as well, we are all there drinking coffee at the same coffee bar with, you know, policemen with automatic weapons stood next to you asking for a, you know, a skinny oat milk latte. And I think that gun does not suit that drink. And, you know, we are all, with the staff at Westminster as well, we are all just talking to each other, but no one ever sees any of that. It doesn't make a good story.
Yeah, no, that's true. So there's a question here from someone called Phil about why you think that Boris still has, I know we should stop calling him Boris and call him why he still has a 40% favourable rating.
I think that people have, Boris Johnson is a man who plays the expectation game incredibly well, in that people have quite low expectations of him. And until there is, that people feel really, really confident in the alternative, the sort of aim low and you'll never be disappointed, and better the devil you know, and people feel like they know him, even though it is my experience that the man of Boris Johnson presents to be, in all my experiences of knowing him and meeting him, is nothing at all like his public persona. Nothing at all. He is not a confident man. He is a shy and scared man. Whenever, maybe it's just me, but he cannot look me in the eye. I mean, they're right. His public persona of being ill prepared is accurate. But the reason that I think he's popular is because he's positive. I think he's a positive character.
Really good point, that it's about I can do things, and that's what we all want to believe. We're really coming up against the time now, so I have one last question for you, which is about the what happened when 35 Tories failed to obey the whip over the reduction in the overseas aid budget, and what actually happens in Westminster when that's quite a sizable amount that decided to stand their ground. And I suppose I'm obviously hoping that a larger number would stand their ground over the reduction of the universal credit. But do they get into trouble? I mean, what happens?
Well, that went through a number of different stages. So there was more of them, and there was enough to lose the vote. And so Boris Johnson and his, you know, the whips and the ministers went around basically. So it's a good tactic, actually, threatening and talking about how to you're not going to vote with your government, or muting it, making, you know, floating the idea, means that the government will come to you, and they do it with all sides, actually. They will come to you with basically a rubbish version of what you're saying and try and basically get you over the line with the rubbish thing. And a lot of members of parliament, once they've threatened to disobey the whip, they are desperately trying to find, because they wanted to, because they were getting pressure from their constituents or whatever to not vote for it. They want something. They will do anything to find a way to say, look, I'm really moral, but actually the government have offered this and we've got to be reasonable. And they do this, and you know that they would just flip in a second. They were desperate not to break the whip because they consider, you know, the greasy pole of Westminster, they want a job eventually. And in fact, in that case, he actually offered jobs out to people. So, but the 35 who stood their ground, I think that, you know, they won't necessarily get in trouble. They'll probably get a bollocking for their weapon. You get put on terrible nosebleed committees at like 7 a.m. That's the kind of thing that happens. Or you'll get a crappy office given out to you if you disobey the whip. You'll get, you know, it's like children, isn't it? It's terrible. It's like if you don't tidy your room, you can't have a pudding. It's a bit like that. And so those things will have happened, and they won't be considered for. But lots of them are like grand dames, aren't they? They're like Andrew Mitchell, who's my neighbouring MP, Tory MP. He wouldn't thank me for saying Birmingham Sutton Coldfield because he calls it the Royal Town. But he, you know, he really cared about this, and he can't be bought because he's in the sort of latter days of his career. He's not bothered about what they can offer him. He's not interested. He doesn't want it. And those people are dangerous. And so you've got to try and find ways to brief against them. So what happens is you'll start seeing newspaper stories spiked about people. So it won't necessarily be that they get shouted at there, but there's got to be some way of undermining them. And so a huge amount of that goes on. Like, oh, I'll tell you a story about so and so, and you'll start to see people getting pressured that way. But on the £20 universal credit thing, what I think will happen already, Steve, what's his name, in Buckinghamshire has breached the wall and said, I'm not going to vote for this. Already that has happened. More will fall in line and we will go out and campaign in those seats about it. So what can I do to change this? I'm going to go and campaign in red wall seats and I'm going to target those people, and so that they feel that they have to vote that way. And then once that happens, that the government will probably renege on that one. I think most likely, that seems like they've already reneged on it once. I think they'll be pushed to renege on it again. So it might not ever get to that vote. But yeah, that's essentially how that happens. But there's a whole lot of horse trading that goes on in votes, and some people can be bought and some people can't.
It's a very good note to come to the end on. Well, we've had one offer from someone who's listened who wants to come and work for you. So you put yourself on anonymously. So please, I can tell by Jess's smile,
Yeah.
I think she'd love a volunteer
Yeah.
for you, someone who's in publishing. And someone else just came in and said, yes, Boris is shy and scared. And I think that is probably true.
Yeah.
Jess, thank you so much. The book is really, really wonderful. We have some signed copies at Newham Books, so do the info is in the chat box. Do come online and see them. Thank you all very, very much. We've had lots of you joining us, and I know lots more will listen to it online. And join us again at 5 by 15 with Neil Gaiman coming on September 10th. We'll send you a ticket.
Yeah, I love him.
To be in conversation with Susanna Clark. So, but Jess, you've been fantastic. I wish all MPs were like you. It's really inspirational, and yeah, let's get involved, everybody. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your summer, and have a good time in Yorkshire, Jess.
Yeah.
Have a good holiday. Yay, take care. Bye bye.
See ya.